Hello everybody, hope you're well. Busy show coming up this week with plenty to pack in, reflecting on all of the action of the past week. And of course, there's plenty more going on this weekend, whether it's in Arlington, Texas, or out in Saudi Arabia with another bill out there. Plus, this week in history, we're going to take you back to 1992 and the fight that kick-started one of the great heavyweight trilogies in Evander Holyfield against Riddick Bowe. We have spoken about the other two fights on This Week in History previously, but this is the one that kick-started it all off. And of course, that round 10. Both this fight and that round have been discussed on a couple of bonus pods that we've done for the lovely Patreons and Apple Plus subscribers over the course of the last few months as well. Loads to get our teeth into. Matthew, Christie, sir, how are you?
I'm good, mate. I am good. How are you?
Not bad. I've grown some stubble over the weekend just to keep you at ease, make you feel comfortable in your own skin and in the environment that I'm trying to create for you and our listeners.
I appreciate that, mate. You're such a selfless individual.
Absolutely. It is relentless, my pursuit of selflessness. Let's hope it's catchy. Maybe some of our friends out in the boxing world can catch on. Right, let's talk about some of the news lines. I can't start with Conor Benn. It'll just do my head in, but we've got to address it. Let's just briefly talk about some of the others. And they might, Matthew, be steering in the same direction. And again, we go out to Saudi Arabia. Last week, Naoya Inoue has been signed up as a Riyadh season ambassador. Riyadh from roughly October to March of each year. Lots of sporting and cultural events going on. And boxing has become very much at the, well, if not at the heart of that, then a big part of it. So Inoue signed up for something like $20 million reportedly. Many will assume, Matt, that means that he will inevitably fight out in Saudi at some stage, which could be an obstacle to Bob Arum, who wants to take him back to the States. But in that press release, it did say that the contract didn't necessarily entail him immediately fighting out in Saudi Arabia.
It's an awful lot of money to spend, though, isn't it? If he's just going to be an ambassador. Don't get me wrong, he seems like a great fella, good-looking guy, good boxer, good to have on side. But I think if you're going to be spending that amount of millions, you would expect to get a bit more from your investment than Inoue just turning up at the odd event and endorsing Riyadh season. So I suspect that we will be building towards a humongous event, one would hope, with Inoue. I don't blame any of these fighters for getting involved with this, for accepting this amount of money. Their careers are short. They give an awful lot to the sport, and in the process, they take an awful lot from themselves. So, yeah, I mean, for as long as this lasts, I think if you're a boxer, I think it would be very difficult to turn it down. And I wasn't remotely surprised to see Inoue kind of getting on that gravy train, to be honest.
Of course, Inoue is fighting on Christmas Eve, isn't he, against an unbeaten Australian. And the suggestion was previously that he would then return to the States in 2025, maybe to fight on some top-rank shows. Does that puncture that ambition, or do you think the Saudi project might be a slightly longer term affair, maybe working towards Bam Rodriguez, maybe moving up in weight, or maybe meeting in between, say at bantam?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they will be plotting a pretty big fight. And I think Inoue versus Rodriguez, in terms of a worldwide crossover fight, is one of the only ones really where they could correctly say it's a show-stopping event. I don't necessarily think that this hookup with Riyadh season will kind of puncture any plans or dreams or hopes that he's going to fight in America earlier next year. I think it's perfectly feasible that of course he's going to go ahead with the fight on Christmas Eve in Japan. I would then expect to see him out in America next year, probably around May, and then he might be the fighter to launch Riyadh season in October next year. if everything goes to plan, this is boxing, and this time next year, Inoue may not be the invincible monster that he is right now.
Good point. Good point. And we'll touch on Bam Rodriguez, who is starting to look better and better. And for me, one of the best fighters. I think currently top 3 best fighters on the planet right now. We'll talk about that shortly. The other news coming from the desert, Matt, is that the General Entertainment Authority Saudis have purchased the Ring magazine. It looks like the website just says coming soon in block capitals, suggesting a revamp and some interesting news, perhaps. Given all that goes along with the Ring magazine, founded in 1922 by Nat Fleischer, it was bought by Oscar De La Hoya's golden boy. What would that be? Perhaps 17 years ago now, back in 2007, Matt. And of course, what goes along with the Ring is prestige and history, but also importantly and perhaps significantly and symbolically, the Ring magazine belt. Now that could just be the step towards a UFC type nirvana that maybe some of the Saudis, maybe Turki Alalshikh himself, are ambition towards, or very much that is the big dream. Is this a huge step along that journey?
Oh, I think it could turn out to be a huge step. I think it was the easiest route to recognising one champion per division. There have been relationships forged with some of the sanctioning bodies, which we've discussed in terms of Riyadh season and the WBA. But what was he going to do? Try and buy all of the sanctioning bodies? Or was he going to create something that is far more appealing than any of those sanctioning body titles, and therefore, in time, the importance of those sanctioning bodies starts to falter, because all anybody is interested in now might be that Ring Championship. As you say there, it is over 100 years old, the Ring. As patrons will know, it's something that I've kind of keep fairly close to my heart, the Ring magazine. But it doesn't have a flawless reputation. Just because something is 100 years old doesn't necessarily mean that it hasn't got a few skeletons in the closet. And the Ring magazine has. Particularly in the late 70s and 80s with the Ring rating scandal. Quite a few people, understandably, when it was purchased by Golden Boy, they felt that the independence of the title would suffer. Having spoken to people that have been the editor of the Ring magazine since that takeover and have worked and written for Ring magazine, I take their word that the ratings are completely independent. But now we have a situation where Saudi Arabia will be in control of those ratings. And whether Turki Alalshikh will be happy to take a step back and use the existing Ring ratings panel remains to be seen. I think they do want to create a bit of a splash with what they're going to do with the Ring. It was still available digitally, but it was no longer on the newsstands. They'd made the decision that for financial reasons it was a more viable business if they were just producing it digitally. It's my understanding that we will get the Ring magazine back in its so you can hold it in your hands in its physical form. I think it's perfectly natural to wonder what kind of copy will be allowed to be in that magazine. Will any criticism of any Riyadh season events be allowed to be published in the Ring magazine that is owned essentially by Riyadh season? We have to wait and see. We haven't got the answers to that yet. But I think ultimately what was the appeal is purely that those rankings and that championship belt that an awful lot of sports fans instantly recognise, whether it's because it was round the waist of Rocky Balboa or whoever, but they will recognise that as a championship. And I think in time, presuming that Riyadh season are in this for the long haul, in time I think you will start to see that will become the championship of choice for obvious reasons, not just because of the heritage, but also for financial reasons. If you're fighting for that championship and you're fighting for it in Saudi Arabia, you're going to get paid well. And you probably won't have to pay any sanctioning fees either.
Indeed. That will be attractive to plenty of people. I suppose what I wonder, Matt, is, and we talk of a Saudi boxing league, however that looks, whatever the format, whatever the shape and manner of that there is talk of that. There is an ongoing with the British Boxing Board of Control very much supervising and coordinating the events out there. It's coming under their umbrella, but right now, on an ongoing basis, event to event, week to week, the medical staff over there are being trained up to perhaps one day stand on their own 2 feet. So I wonder, Matt, how inclusive the future will look like beyond Saudi Arabia. You have to reach out to the wider world, of course, because fighters are coming from all across the planet. I wonder how inclusive that's going to look. I've no idea. Personally, I've no idea how it's going to look, but I do wonder.
I think steps are being taken so that they can kind of manage the business in Saudi Arabia without any outside help. As you say, we know that ultimately the aim is to have their own commission out there that is fit for purpose. And they will have doctors out there that are fully trained to a high standard, so that they will essentially be able to stage events without any outside help. That, I think, is a concern. But why is it a concern? I think we should be asking ourselves. Because is it a concern that Great Britain can look after itself? It doesn't need any outside help. I think it's a concern because they will be very, very new to this. And I think there may be the odd concern, again, that they're completely controlling the boxing landscape. So we wait and see, don't we? I mean, going back to the Ring magazine, it bothers me a little bit because I've always enjoyed reading the Ring magazine, and I think if you're going to be controlling the content and the message from one of the most respected brands in the industry, then is this just the start of a slippery slope for universal control of the sport? Or do we need someone? We've always been crying out, haven't we, for one body to come in and essentially grab the sport by the scruff of the neck. But we'll see if this is just the start, or is this just another bit of window dressing, essentially? Is this, look what we've got now, look what we've done and look what we've got now. We've got the Ring magazine. We've rescued the Ring magazine and it's back on the shelves, this institution of the sport. But we wait and see. It's really interesting what's happening over there at the moment. But I think what was encouraging was the desire to stage events all over the world. So it wasn't just purely being staged in Saudi Arabia. I think we will see less and less events being staged all over the world. I think the cost is just too much. I think people in government over there are starting to ask questions as to, well, what exactly are we getting for all of this money? So I think we will see more and more events staged in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, absolutely. In a report, article in the Financial Times in recent weeks suggesting that the reins have very much been applied to those outside sporting events. So it's going to be more in-house. And why should a kind of Saudi boxing commission be any worse or any less effective than some of those over in America? Let's be honest about it. Some of those over in America sometimes are not worth the paper they're written on.
No, absolutely not. And I completely agree with that. And I think out of all of the commissions in the world that they could have chosen to kind of get them started, they made a wise choice with the British Boxing Board of Control. I think the board are one of a few who do things the right way, or they attempt to do things the right way. There are others in America, don't get me wrong, Nevada Commission, New York. But as you say, yeah, I mean, I think we need to be a little bit careful about being too cynical about things like this. But I think we also need to ensure that our eyes are as open as they possibly can be when things like this are starting to take place in the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. Self-governance, that can be a good thing. All-consuming control and power, that can then lead to something slightly different. So we'll monitor how all of that plays out. Now, last Wednesday, was it? We had X messages, Twitter messages from Eddie Hearn, from Conor Benn as well. Ultimately, how you phrase this is probably up to you. Conor Benn and Eddie Hearn will say they've been cleared to fight. And I suppose, essentially, he has been cleared to fight. I think the most appropriate way to say is his suspension by UKAD and the British Boxing Board of Control, that has been lifted, that suspension. Why, Matthew? Why?
It's my understanding. I've followed this, and I think people know I've followed this case from the very start really, really closely. And it's my understanding that he hasn't yet been asked to explain why clomiphene was in his system. There's some procedural things going on behind the scenes with the testing that Ben has been vocal about being unhappy with. So that would appear to be why the National Anti-Doping Panel can't say for certain that Ben was cheating and therefore should be suspended. And that is why his suspension has essentially been lifted. But goodness gracious me, I've got fatigue on this now. I've got to be honest. I really have.
Well, the phrase from the NADP, the National Anti-Doping Panel, is they were, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but they were, the phrase I can quote is, they were not comfortably satisfied. That's the phrase, not comfortably satisfied. That's a direct quote. But they were not comfortably satisfied that UKAD could effectively prove that Ben did use performance-enhancing drugs. That's me rephrasing what they've said. They're not comfortably satisfied that was the case. I suppose I would ask the question, and this is impossible to answer, but did somehow the procedures in testing, did that somehow cause a false positive test? Who can answer that? But ultimately, as we've said on the pod again and again and again, and it's been at the heart of it, this seems a procedural issue and I suppose a legal attack on that procedural approach. Have those positive tests ever been processed? Is a question I've asked again and again and again. And ultimately, I think we're still asking the same question. Have those two positive tests that showed up for clomiphene, have they been processed at all? Has Conor Benn had to answer for the presence of a banned substance not once but twice? Has he had to answer for those two positive tests? Has he had to explain those two positive tests?
You asking me, or you leaving that hanging?
Play it as you see it.
Probably best to leave it hanging.
Okay.
But
Okay.
what I will say though is I can't see any evidence of him explaining that during one of these many processes. I mean, you look at the timeline on this. October 2022 was when this all started. I remember you and I initially being excited to meet up, spend a bit of time together during fight week, and then this news breaking the day before we were due to go to London. So that's October 2022. March the 15th, 2023, Ben was then provisionally suspended by UKAD. July 2023, that suspension was lifted. August 2023, UKAD and the British Boxing Board of Control said they were going to appeal that ruling. May 2024, the appeal was successful, and here we are again now, and the provisional suspension has again been lifted. UKAD have 21 days from the date of that ruling, which I believe was the 6th of November, to appeal. Whether they do or not, we still don't know. I would have said it would probably have been sensible from Conor Benn's point of view, probably to wait until those 21 days had passed before doing what he's done throughout this process and going on social media and announcing various things. But I would be surprised now if there was another appeal. And I think it's important to stress that this is in UKAD's court now. It's not a decision that the British Boxing Board of Control can make. It's UKAD who were involved with this case last week. It wasn't the British Boxing Board of Control. I think the board had a certain amount of involvement in the appeal, in that they backed UKAD and they were going to go forward with that. But on this occasion now, it is down to whether or not UKAD decide to appeal it. I think there's different ways of looking at this. I think, number one, you could say it was fairly, not damning necessarily, but had UKAD and the British Boxing Board of Control released statements last week, for example, that said, yes, he has been cleared, and the board had said something along the lines of, we look forward to welcoming him back, we're glad we've got to the bottom of this. Both of them were essentially saying we've still got to wait and see what happens in the next 21 days. UKAD are saying they're considering their position. So one could draw the conclusion from that neither party is particularly happy with this latest ruling, and we know that both parties have seen far more in terms of evidence in this case than pretty much anybody. However, let's put the boot on the other foot. For example, let's look at it from Conor Benn's point of view. If there is a flawed testing system that means that there was a false positive potentially, then that testing system needs to be addressed as a matter of priority. Otherwise, the testing system isn't fit for purpose. And although we could be saying about Conor Benn, well, what's he doing? Why does he keep saying he's innocent when he's not? For all we know, he may have a case here that there was some seriously dodgy goings on with the testing procedure, in which case that needs to be looked at.
Absolutely. You are absolutely right. And if he's gone through all of that because of that, then you can totally understand his anxiety and stress and emotions over the course of the last 2 years. And there's a bit of that in his statement. Totally, absolutely. But if the procedural positions had nothing to do with the positive test, in other words, if a legal loophole has been exploited because of the procedures, not because of what came up in that test, if those are two completely separate things, then that is a different discussion entirely.
I think the other thing to consider is how much money it must have cost to get to this point, and whether Ben knowingly took an illegal substance or didn't, whether there was a cock-up with the testing procedure or not. An awful lot of athletes in Ben's position wouldn't have been able to take things this far because of the cost involved. And I don't know this, but I suspect this will be an end to it due to that cost. I'm sure if UCAD had limitless funds to take it back and hire a legal team, particularly a legal team as good as the one that Ben's got, then they might do so. That would seem to be their message in all of this. They don't feel like it's been resolved. But, it's getting to a point where you kind of just want to draw a line in the sand. And I understand that. I completely understand that. You think of the other sports that UCAD are also trying to move forward with and ensure that all of the procedures are correct there. And if they are spending an awful lot of their limited financial reserves on this one case, then certain people might look at that and say, it's just a waste. That money could be spent elsewhere. Whether we'll look back on all of this as a lesson, I don't know. But I think ultimately, and this perhaps and hopefully is the final point on it for now, if there were some serious faults along the way, if there was some negligence along the way on behalf of the testers, then I would hope that we get to see the details of this case. If Ben has actually stood in front of a committee and explained why clomiphene was in his system and they were satisfied that he may have been an accident, then we need to see that as well. For the sake of the sport, for the sake of VADA, for the sake of UCAD, for the sake of the British Boxing Board of Control, for the sake of Conor Benn, and for the sake of Eddie Hearn. We need to see as much as possible with this case. As things stand, it has not been published, and Conor Benn is the person who would have to say yes, it can be. I'm not saying he's refused that. I'm not saying that for 1 second. But hopefully we will get more information on this, because something has gone seriously wrong somewhere. Whether it's at this stage with the National Anti-Doping Panel, or whether it was during the testing, whether it was before that at certain appeals, something has gone wrong. Either for Ben to have been out of action for so long and it wasn't his fault, or being allowed back into a sport without explaining how on earth that got into his system.
And both Eddie Hearn and Conor Benn tweeted last Wednesday. Eddie Hearn's line was that Ben had been cleared of any wrongdoing by the NADP, the National Anti-Doping Panel. I suppose I just question, has he? Has he had to? Because had this gone to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, had it gone right down to the final leg of it, the burden of proof would have rested with the athlete, Conor Benn, to explain how that got into his system, not, in this instance, the National Anti-Doping Panel saying that UCAD had to prove more reasonably that Ben had used PEDs. The burden of proof is completely the other way around with the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So that's an interesting point to take. Has Ben had to explain those tests? That still remains the big question for me. Have those tests been answered, but we may never know, but maybe we will. As Matt said, maybe some more information will be published further down the line. It's going to be a case that goes down in history one way or another, and it's hopefully the last time we're going to talk about it. To be honest, apart from over a pint, maybe in 10 years' time, maybe more will come out further down the line. It usually always does, but anyway, for now, it seems a line in the sand unless UCAD appeal in the next 2.5 weeks, which seems unlikely. Let's talk about the good stuff, shall we? Let's talk about the boxing. We had Boots and Bam in action in Philly over the weekend. Boots Ennis not quite as sparkling in the rematch against Chakazian, who clearly was much better prepared this time around. And maybe had slight excuses. I think ultimately you have to put yourself in the shoes of Boots, in the mind of the man. I mean, who can get up for a fight that you've won 119, 108 or whatever it was on the scorecards previously? I suspect that probably was the revolving door truth of that fight. But you give a lot of credit to Chakazian, and he showed maybe one or two other people's that the Boots Ennis can be hit. He can be ruffled. Chakazian wasn't the man to beat him, but he maybe showed others some avenues to that idea.
I think we said last week, didn't we, that the only way this might be competitive if there's a bit of complacency in Boots Ennis, and I think complacency might be the wrong word, but ultimately I hear the dissenting voices that are saying that, well, Boots there, he's easy to hit. Fights like that against one of the bigger junior middles, he might come unstuck, but you can't tell me that he will go into a fight against any of those guys with the mindset that he had on Saturday night. I think his opponent would have had the opportunity to go away and do far more homework as a consequence of their first fight, and he will have had the benefit of sharing 12 rounds with Ennis. Bit of a practice run for him. That doesn't really happen after fights like that a rematch is called, but Chakazian had that, didn't he? He had that benefit. So he was better. Ennis was a bit more careless. The fight was marginally more exciting. But I think we just move. Let's just move on now. I think either go for your best possible rivals at welterweight. I know that winning all the belts is still what drives everyone forward when they're at that level. So if that's what you want to do, you want to be undisputed, then now is the time. There's also some suggestion that he's outgrowing welterweight. And if that is true, and you look around at the welterweight landscape, you think, well, what is the point in starving yourself here? The better fighters, the better names, perhaps the fighters that can bring out the best in Boots Ennis. And I still believe he's a special talent. I really do. I haven't wavered from that at all after seeing what happened on Saturday night. But I think this is a fighter who is in the peak of his powers. I would probably move up to 154, go and target those names at 154 and all of those tasty matchups there. But yeah, he doesn't need another treading water type fight, does he?
No, and there just aren't the names around. I mean, listen, Gennady Golovkin defended his middleweight title, 8, 9, 10 times, fighting people you hadn't heard of in places that you weren't familiar with for quite some time before he really broke out in the States. So, there's always that route if you just want to be a champion. But I think people like Ennis, they're destined to be great, or they dare to be great, don't they? And with his skills, you feel that 154, Beck and Shirley were bigger, better names. Bam Rodriguez, though, Matt, I mean, he's a special talent, isn't he? He was so good again at the weekend. He literally, within one round, was starting to close the gap and really go after Pedro Guevara, and he became the first man to stop the 35-year-old. Just simply too good. And once again, You saw so many of the facets and characteristics that make him a special fighter. And when I was watching him, I was just thinking and comparing and contrasting him to Jai Opetaia, because Opetaia's a really athletic, rangy southpaw. But if I'm in the Opetaia camp, because if you watch Opetaia, one of his real failings is I was speaking to Barry Jones about this the other night. Opetaia, he steals his own space when he attacks, and he ends up far too close to the target, and he can't really work. And it's a real failing of Opetaia. For someone as good as him, it's a real Achilles heel. You're in the Opetaia business, watch Bam Rodriguez. As an athletic, talented southpaw, this is how you do it. This is how you work around the space and the distance. That slight half step back when he's already committed. He does the spin around. He does that lovely little step back and then the uppercut. I mean, he is quality. I think him and Usyk for me, and then Inoue, I'd revolve the top three around them. Just something else, this kid. And what age is he? 24, Matt? I mean, come on. Play fair.
He does appear to be getting better with each passing fight, doesn't he? And I think even though it was a half-decent opponent on Saturday, I don't think anybody would have been picking an upset there. So the complacency might even have crept in to Bam Rodriguez, but there was no hint of it. He got his man out of there. It was a ferocious finish as well, wasn't it? Not convinced we needed all of the knockdowns. I think it could have been stopped after the second one. But yeah, he is something he is someone who is starting to look extra special. He is someone who is starting to look like a future Hall of Famer. And you don't often say that about people that are not even 25 yet. But his resume is building as well. He's fought really good opposition. And yeah, I hope that he retains the discipline and the studious outlook on the sport that he's very clearly got. And that desire to get better and to test himself is evident in every fight. Seems exceptionally likeable as well. Yeah, I like him a lot. You didn't mention Terence Crawford, so have you booted Crawford out and you've got Bam in?
He's just inactive, isn't he, at the moment? Yeah, relatively inactive.
He fought a couple of months ago, but you're not.
What, once in the last year and a half?
Yeah, true. And that is the thing, isn't it? I mean, he's also active, Bam Rodriguez, and this wasn't like a late call up, but this was something, as you identified last week, to boost the appeal of this bill, because topping it, you had a rematch that nobody wanted. So let's throw in one of the most promising stars in the sport to add a bit of spice to the event. And yeah, I think he did exactly that. It's important to remember the opponent was a good opponent. Wouldn't have been the number one choice, but he was a good, solid, proven opponent, and Rodriguez just took him to pieces. He
did. He looks terrific. In my heart, I hope they don't dish up Chocolatito to him. I just hope they don't. I know they had some really good sparring a couple of months ago, didn't they? And on the back of that sparring, I think Gonzalez is actually now mooted the idea of the fight taking place. As I said, I think last week, I am finding it a bit more difficult these days to see the old warriors or the older fighters dished up to the young bucks. I do find that more challenging as a fan now than ever before. So, but it might happen. He fought, didn't he, a month or two ago in Nicaragua against basically an opponent who wasn't good enough, Chocolatito. So he came back with a win. He's 37 now. They've got that sparring story. Chocolatito's resume and history speaks for itself. So that's a fight that can sell, no doubt about it. I love them both, but my heart's with Gonzalez, and I just wouldn't like to see him I wouldn't like to see him go out that way, but maybe he deserves one big last crack at a young talent like Rodrigo Bam.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same as you. You kind of, yes, it's a marketable fight. Chocolatito, for crying out loud. And you can't say that with everything that he's achieved that he doesn't deserve a chance against
And
Bam
by the way,
Rodriguez.
Matt, we might have not to the same extent, not by any stretch, but there might have been some of the same sentiment when he fought Cal Yafai a couple of years ago. Some of the same sentiment.
Yeah, there was, and I thought Cal Yafai would win that fight, and Chocolatito looked terrific. He didn't look as good as new. He's not going to look as good as new again. But now and again, we do get one of these veterans that surprises us. But I just think the level of Rodriguez at the moment, I think there's only one winner in that fight. It's not like a Bernard Hopkins coming back and then winning a light heavyweight title by out hustling a Tavoris Cloud or a Shumanov, or it's not Foreman knocking out Michael Moorer. Michael Moorer, although he was well regarded, nobody thought that he was close to being invincible. And there's just something about Rodriguez where I just don't think, even in boxing, a storyline exists where he's going to be picked off by a 37-year-old veteran, to be perfectly honest. He might meet his match along the way. I'm sure he will. 99% of them do. But I don't think it will be kind of a shop-worn, one eye on the exit door Chocolatito that does it.
I do hope and think they could do Bam against Inoue at bantamweight. I think that fight could be made. I think he's got the size and he's small enough to come back down. But without knowing the details of weight making, I think that could be just around the corner, folks. My goodness me, that is just about the best fight you can make in boxing. And finally, looking back on the weekend, of course, on Friday night in Virginia, we had the Davies brothers. Manager Mum Wanda ringside as well, watching all three of her boys in action on the night. Kelvin moved to 14-0. Keon made a winning debut. And Keyshawn, who's flying the flag and leading the way for the family with a sparkling second round knockout of Gustavo Lemos. The same Lemos had only lost over 12 previously to Robertson Hitchens, who in about 2 or so weeks will fight the Australian paddle for a world title on December the 7th. So that is a result that on paper looks fantastic. And you know what I loved about this, Matt? The occasion. You know, that sometimes all of that stuff, you can roll your eyes with our friends and cousins across the Atlantic. But sometimes they really do get it absolutely bang on, don't they? And with the band from Pernell Whitaker's old school, Booker T, the band from that school, drumming and piping and bugling and trumpeting Keyshawn Davis to the ring with a smile and a swagger. What an occasion it was. Prior to that, up on the big screen, they had a montage of Pernell, a fellow, of course, Norfolk, Virginia fighter. It was fantastic. What a job Top Rank and everybody concerned did with that. What a homecoming for those Davies boys. And what a performance from Keyshawn, who showed pretty much in what limited time we had why so many people, Mike Costello, formerly of the BBC and DAZN, now very much top of the list, why they're getting excited about him.
He was only, was he in action for 4 minutes? And within that 4 minutes, he showcased what a promising fighter he is. I think the fact that he was orchestrating the finish as he's moving backwards and getting full power into those shots. I think we said last week that it might be one of those fights where we look back on it and say, well, that was clever matchmaking. I think that is the case. But that wasn't a no-hoper that he just ripped to pieces in that amount of time. He does look like the complete fighter. He looks like the complete fighter, however, at this level. So we don't get too excited yet. But he, again, and I was thinking this over the weekend, there was an awful lot of good performances over the weekend. There was an awful lot of promise. There was an awful lot to get excited about. And a lot of these guys are young fighters. So, yeah, the future does look bright. I mean, Keyshawn, to me, again, he's another one who you think, well, crikey, how far can he go? But we still need to see him moved, but he's being moved very, very intelligently. And I also said last week, keep an eye on Abdullah Mason, didn't I? Wasn't expecting it to be quite like that, but that was an exciting fight, wasn't it? That opening round. Crikey, did you see that?
I've not caught up with that fight yet, so I'll go and look at it. I know you mentioned that. And last week I said I'm not 100% sold on Keyshawn, but you've got to say, on the back of that, you can see why other people are. I think that was a big jump forward in terms of, we've seen glimpses of that skill set, but he is good. I mean, the three different sort of facets. The first knockdown where he slipped Lemos's first attack and then came back with that really sharp right counter. So it was the slip and then right counter. And then the second knockdown was the feint and then the left hook. So he's showing such intelligence and variety. And then it was left hook body, left hook head, right uppercut, wasn't it, for the third knockdown? We do have to couch all of the praise and excitement by the saga with weight in fight week, where this fight, I suppose surprisingly, and I do think maybe the promoters and the teams have got to take a bit of responsibility for this, because it was made at lightweight, Matt, and Lemos hasn't fought at lightweight for 2 years since he fought Lee Selby. He's been fighting up at super light welter. So, you sign the contracts, you're supposed to make weight, but he was being asked to make a weight that he hadn't made in a couple of years. So potentially it was a big ask. Either way, he didn't make lightweight. He weighed in 6 pounds. I think he was 141 plus. And they basically did a sort of IBF type ruling, didn't they? Where he was only allowed to put on 10 pounds within a certain time frame. And so he ultimately, on the day of the fight, weighed 144.6, and Keyshawn actually weighed 141.2. So there was only a few pounds between them. Although I think come fight night, I think I heard Christina Poncha saying that Lemos had rehydrated up to 155 on the night. But they basically stage managed that as best they could. They dealt with a bad situation as best they could. Who knows what impact that had on Lemos on the night?
Yeah, we don't know. There were a few suggestions that he might have been weakened. Sometimes you see fighters come in well over the contracted weight, and you can see why. But with Lemos, he was pretty ripped, and I think like you kind of think, well, could he have made it? Ultimately, he will have been the one that will go, yes, I can. Absolutely, I can get back down there for that money and that opportunity, no problem at all. One also wonders, if it wasn't the kind of homecoming of the three Davis brothers, would that fight have been pulled? You could make an argument that it should have been. I think when someone is that much over the weight limit, you have to ask the question, should this fight take place? Should there be a rule in place, a universal rule, that if you miss weight by any more than 2-3 pounds, then the fight doesn't take place? Or 5 pounds? I mean, it's such a huge miss, particularly when you're down in the lower weight classes where there are not that many pounds to be working with anyway. But I don't know, ultimately the fight took place and Keyshawn Davis looked great. Also, I thought given what we knew about Lemos's weight beforehand, that Davis looked like the bigger fighter in there. He's got really impressive dimensions, hasn't he, in terms of his wingspan, his height, and he carries it really well. He's a real menace, Keyshawn Davis, and I very much look forward to seeing what comes next for him. No need to rush, but I would say in the next year to 18 months he will be recognised as one of the best in the sport.
Well, the problem or the balance that he and his team have to coordinate now, the situation is they're there. It's Anthony Joshua 2015, 2016 all over again because he's there. He's ranked number 3 in 3 of the sanctioning bodies. He's basically in line now to fight Baranchik. He boldly called out Tank Gervonta Davis immediately afterwards with a big wide-eyed sparkle in his eyes and a naughty smile on his face. So fair play. 10,000 plus fans in there as well, Matt, for a guy who's, having his 12th fight. I mean, wow. That doesn't have whet the appetite, doesn't it? What a way to sell yourself. So, yeah, I mean, push or pull, I think they're going to push. I would imagine it's Baranchik next. Or soon.
Yeah, I think, as far as I'm aware, that is what they're going to be looking at. And I think they're probably right to do so. I think it's a good comparison with Anthony Joshua. And I think even though Joshua won Olympic gold, and we know what Davis was doing in the Olympics, but I also think that Davis has had... he had a much longer education in the amateur code. He was fighting the best in the world for a long time in the amateur code. So I think you could make that argument that he's probably ready now. And I think Baranchik as well. It's you're not going to pick against Davis in that matchup, are you?
No.
So I think he's the kind of opponent that he needs as well. I think he'll give him rounds. So yeah, I mean, I'm battling here not to get too excited because I thought he was that good, and it wasn't the fact that he just took him out in 2 rounds. It was the manner in which he did so, the way he puts his punches together at exactly the right time, his ability to counter punches, his ability to just ever so slightly step away from the punches that are coming at him, and in order to find the room to craft his own, which is all done in a split second, was incredible. It really was. But we've been wrong before, and we've said so many times that there is a temptation, and I don't know if it's just with American fighters, it's not actually, but there's a few American fighters off the top of my head that I can think of where you just get overexcited too soon. Whether it's because of the noise, whether it's because of the positivity and everybody saying the same thing, whether it's because of better visibility, I don't know. But a certain fighter who had a solid amateur career, is unbeaten as a pro, has never encountered any kind of adversity in the professional ranks, and you are already starting to use the word legend to describe them. Superstar. He's not there yet, but the foundations most certainly are. But that is what separates the kind of the prospects from the champions. Is that it's all well and good having all of that ability, but it's when the competition in the opposite corner gets tougher, that's when they prove themselves, and that's when they really make their names. But he's certainly one that we should all keep a very close eye on, and I hope he remains active.
So what we spoke about was Sugar Ray Leonard last week, wasn't it? That ability to find another gear, to find an answer when you're challenged, when things get tough, to find a way to win. Does Keyshawn Davis have that in his locker? Well, he's in a division rich with quality. Gervonta Davis, of course. Shakur coming back. You've got Sam Noakes over here. You have eyes on all of that. And Andy Cruz, let's not forget him, the Cuban. Andy Cruz floating around as well. And this weekend, you've got Zepeda in action. That's one of the fights that we're looking forward to. Zepeda against Farmer. You've got Ramirez, Barboza, CBS against Gilberto Ramirez. All of that coming up on Saturday in Saudi. And then on Friday out in Texas, you've got Katie Taylor against Serrano. Rematch from that knee buckler a couple of years ago at Madison Square Garden. You've also got Barrios against Ramos and Jake Paul, Mike Tyson on that bill as well. And we will talk about all of that in a special bonus pod for Patreons and Apple Plus subscribers in the next couple of days. If you want to sign up for that, you can do so on Apple Plus or go to patreon.com and you can get the Patreon app synced up with your pod provider. Ad-free bonus content each and every week for less than a $5 a month. And we'll have all of this weekend's action. Tips and previews coming up in the next few days. Coming up next is This Week. This week, we take you back to the 13th of November, 1992, at the Thomas and Mack in Vegas. 18,000 plus there to see the start of one of boxing's heavyweight trilogies. Evander Holyfield against Riddick Bowe. 28-0 against 31-0. Battle of the unbeatens. And the two big storylines here, Matt. Bowe getting his opportunity. Is he good enough? Has he been prepared enough? And Evander Holyfield striving for recognition as a heavyweight in the eyes of the sporting and the boxing public.
That's exactly right. We've said it before, haven't we, when we've discussed the second fight and the third fight, that it was the first fight, perversely, that Evander Holyfield lost, where he at last won that respect. At last, people realised what a fighter he was. There was a lot of talk, wasn't there, in the early going here about Riddick Bowe has never been in with anybody like Holyfield. I was surprised, actually, listening back to this commentary, how hot Lampley, Merchant were about Evander Holyfield's chances in this fight, given that they'd all been fairly critical of him against the likes of Smoking Burt Cooper, George Foreman, Larry Holmes. Crikey, George Foreman, I'll get onto him in a bit. But anyway, but really, if you look at it as well from the other point of view, and I went back and I looked at all of the fighters that Evander Holyfield had fought as a heavyweight prior to fighting Riddick Bowe, you could also argue that it was the first world-class heavyweight that Holyfield had fought who was at their peak. So he'd fought James Tillis, Pinklon Thomas, Michael Dokes, Adilson Rodriguez, Alex Stewart, you could argue, was at his peak, but Alex Stewart was not quite at Riddick Bowe's level. There was a Seamus McDonough kind of tune-up. Then he went into a fought and beaten, underprepared James Buster Douglas. George Foreman, 41 years old at the time, or 42. Good old Smoking Burt Cooper then gave him a scare. And Larry Holmes, who was well past his best, also went 12 rounds with Evander Holyfield. So I think for both of them, it was kind of the litmus test, wasn't it? What a fight! It's a tremendous fight that is brewing and bubbling, and then all of a sudden it catches fire. But this is one of those heavyweight fights where you watch it and you think, how do they do it? How do they keep doing it round after round? I think as early as round 4, you have got round 3, and Lou Duva, who was obviously part of Holyfield's corner, is telling Holyfield that Riddick Bowe is tiring. There was even a suggestion from the commentary team after the first round that Riddick Bowe is just not going to be able to cope in there. After the 4th round, Eddie Futch of Team Riddick Bowe is telling his charge that Holyfield is tiring. At the end of the 5th round, George Benton, who was obviously part of Holyfield, who's Holyfield's trainer, is telling Holyfield that Bowe is tiring. They're both tiring. They're both knackered. But the fact that they kept finding something round after round after round until, of course, we get to the round, which was the 10th, one of the greatest in heavyweight history, is nothing short of supersonic. I just can't get my head around how these guys do it. I really can't. The other thing that stood out for me was George Foreman. I mean, sometimes he does have a little. He was having some howlers on this night, George Foreman. I was like, what are you banging on about? But now and again, George Foreman he used to offer a really astute observation. But increasingly, as we're doing these look backs now, and I hear George Foreman on, I'm like, what is he going to say now? It's worth watching it just to listen to George. It's something else.
Yeah, he's in full flight, isn't he? Just before the fight, he says this moment is bigger than boxing itself, as he's trying to give a sense of what it's like to be in a heavyweight title fight, or to be approaching becoming a heavyweight champion of the world. But of course, the context for this is Mike Tyson. This is November 92. Tyson going to jail in the April of 1992, and suddenly then everyone looking at the landscape. They tried to make Holyfield Bowe around that time, didn't they, earlier in the year, and they couldn't agree financial terms. So in the intervening period, Bowe earned his number one spot by beating Coetzee earlier on, just a few months previously, over 7 rounds. So that's what got him this spot. He could have had the fight previously, but they just didn't agree terms. That, of course, would be a story in Bowe's career going forward. Fight of the Year and the Ring Magazine's 1992 Round of the Year. Roll on round 10. It's really the last minute and a half. Big, strong start and then a huge finish. And you get the famous line from Larry Merchant regarding Holyfield. If he's 205 pounds, his heart weighs 204. Homage to Holyfield, who at the start of the round, Matt, is almost frozen by an uppercut. He throws that shot really well, Bowe, doesn't he? He just steps back and throws it really quickly, the right uppercut. And Holyfield kind of freezes and then slowly staggers backwards and somehow recovers and comes back.
Yeah, it's the how he found it within him to come back from that. I think is testament to the Evander Holyfield that we now all love and admire. And while doing so, only weighing 205 pounds. I think this was the last time he'd be anything like that light in his career. I think he was obviously gambling on speed, being the quicker man. But Bowe's infighting skills for someone of his size at this particular point were superb. I think Riddick Bowe on this night would, I'm not saying he'd have beaten Muhammad Ali, calm down everybody. I'm not saying he'd have beaten Larry Holmes, but on this version of Riddick Bowe, for talent and ability, for punching power and being able to withstand punches coming back at him, I think this is one of the best heavyweights in history on this night. It was oh so brief that we got to see Riddick Bowe at his best. But on this night, I think any heavyweight in history would have had a really difficult night with him. Holyfield at times, I think, is exposed. I mean, he's very hook happy all the way through, isn't he, Holyfield? But he puts forth an insane effort as well. And it's actually the fight goes into the 7th round before either of them really appear to have been visibly hurt. And that, I think, is when Bowe lands one of those uppercuts and Holyfield's head, rather than just stubbornly remaining in position, is jerked backwards for the first time. And that's where those are the kind of movements from a fighter taking a punch where you start to get a little bit concerned that their punch resistance might be flagging a little bit. Yeah, but you know that this was Evander Holyfield. Already, I thought it was interesting as well. Going back to what the commentators were saying, already at the start when they were saying that Riddick Bowe had never been in a tough fight, I think Lampley says something like Holyfield has been in a lot of tough fights, and a lot of people would say he's been in too many. This was back in what, 92. This is 3 years before he beat Mike Tyson. And before he gained revenge over Michael Moorer. And yeah, a good, 25 years before he had that horrible comeback fight. But yeah, it's such a good contest. I'll be surprised if anybody who listens to this hasn't seen it. But even if you have, there's just, even for just George Foreman, his observations on the fight at certain stages are very amusing. And you mentioned there Pierre Coetzee. This was another period in history that used to fascinate me, because this is when I would be studying all the sanctioning body rankings, and every now and again you'd get this heavyweight that kind of emerged from obscurity and would just be ranked by all 3 sanctioning bodies really high. And Pierre Coetzee was one of them, and he kind of dined out on that. He would fight, lost to Riddick Bowe. He would lose to Frank Bruno, and he would lose to George Foreman. But there was another one around this time, Alex Garcia. I don't know if anybody remembers Alex Garcia. He was just almost like he's just been airlifted into the rankings. Everyone's like, who is this guy? But there were a fair few in the heavyweight division back then.
Yeah. Well, if you read that Jim Brady book, Boxing Confidential, and I did say to the patrons the other day, I've been flagging that up, but apparently it's difficult to get your hands on these days. So if you do manage to get that or have got that, then you're pretty lucky. But yeah, all the why fighters like Alex Garcia got parachuted in, you'll find out exactly why. Fascinating stuff in that particular book. And into round 11, Matt, actually no knockdown in round 10, amazingly, unbelievably. But there is in round 11 when Holyfield is hurt, his left hook and a right hand, and he's up against the ropes. And actually, he's hit round the back of the head, isn't it? I mean, should have been, potentially disqualification, actually, there in that moment. And finally goes down, but it's a shot to the back of the head while he's not even facing the right way that puts them down. You know, our old friend Joe Cortez making a meal of that, as usual. But yeah, round 11, we do get a knockdown, seriously hurt. And you get that Jim Lampley line where he says, to get out of this round would seem like a miracle. Well, of course, Holyfield produces the miracle, sees it out, but loses on the cards 1-1-2, 1-1-5, and then 1-1-10, 1-1-7 twice. And ultimately, we get the rightful winner. But in defeat, Holyfield does gain something. Lampley says, Evander Holyfield beaten, but perhaps more champion than ever before. Going back to the pre-fight theme and prevailing moods, Matt.
Yeah, exactly, and he was. I mean, there's quite a good interview with Holyfield after the fight. They speak to Bowe at ringside, then they speak to quite a crestfallen Evander Holyfield, and you can see the damage there. They do a few close-ups, don't they? They go right close in on his face, above both eyes. Both eyes are swollen.
Forehead as well.
You can see the damage, and it's a very damaging sport. With the benefit of hindsight, I wonder if Riddick Bowe was ever the same again after this fight. Holyfield somehow managed to come back and look as good as new. I'm not convinced Riddick Bowe ever did. But what I will say is that if you'd have told me on this night that they're going to have a rematch in about a year's time and Evander Holyfield is going to win it, I'd have thought you were crackers, because Bowe just seemed to be a little bit better in most departments. And the ones where he wasn't better, he made up for with his size. And he looked like he had the superior punching power. So to say that Holyfield would go back to the drawing board and be able to craft a victory in the rematch at this point would have looked exceptionally unlikely.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. And in that interview that Matt's talking about in Holyfield's dressing room afterwards, you can see the pain etched across his face, both literally and physically and mentally. But when asked about what he would do and whether he would continue boxing, actually, by Larry Merchant, Holyfield says, I don't want to see no gloves for a while. And he absolutely means it, doesn't he? I don't want to see no gloves for a while. On a night when Junior Jones had a third round stoppage win to move to 26, and he would lose 2 out of 3 by knockout a couple of years later in 94. But of course, he'd beat Barrera twice 5 years later, 96, 97. He'd beat Barrera twice on the spin. And Michael Moorer on this show as well. He'd have a second round stoppage win. He was a couple of years away from fighting both Holyfield and Foreman. Of course, earlier on this year, he'd beaten Smoking Bert Cooper in a fight that we previewed a couple of weeks ago, Moorer against Cooper. But Holyfield and Foreman round the corner for the unbeaten Moorer, who moved to 30-0. And speaking of Smoking Bert, he might just be appearing against Holyfield in the next couple of weeks on This Week in History. Just maybe. Don't forget, coming up this week, later on this week, we'll have that special bonus pod on Patreon and on Apple Plus for you lovely supporters. And we will speak to you again soon. Take care.